Hey class, so I am making this screencast to try to explain CSS positioning along with a few other concepts you might want to know in order to complete your resume assignment. I apologize for the loud lawnmower outside of my office. I'm sure he'll finish before we do. So, I've already created a kind of dummy page here. This is just a bunch of gibberish text. And this is a box. It's a div, or division on the page. Let me show you. Here it is, div, class equals box. We don't need this ID, actually. And if we switch over to the CSS, you'll see this box has a handful of rules. So width and height, a border, a background color, and a font size so you can read it. So as it mentions in the box, this box has no positioning rules. Or to put that another way, it's set to the default, or position static. We'll never have to write position static because again it's the default. Everything is set to be position static automatically. So let me get rid of that for now. I will talk about the other three forms of positioning momentarily. First thing I wanted to talk about is how to create a sidebar here. If we want to create a sidebar that just looks like we have a two-column site, it's pretty straightforward. And we kind of already know how to do it. I just need to walk you through it. The first thing I'd want to do is I'm going to turn this box into our sidebar. That's the first thing. The second thing is I need to float this to the left because I want all this content to go to the right of it. So, float left. Okay, so now it's floating left. You can tell because this text came up alongside it, but the other problem is it's not very tall. Now I could add a whole bunch of content, like type a bunch of text into this sidebar, and that would make it taller. But I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to declare a height, which is about equal to the height of my content. Pretty much. It's getting there. I could also have done that probably with padding bottom, and there's lots of different ways of getting some height on your element. But now this looks like it is a sidebar. You can see that all of our text content is running right up against it, though. That's not very nice. So let me say margin right, and I'll just say, I don't know, 30 pixels. Much nicer. Okay, so it's a sidebar. Why am I showing you how to make a sidebar? Well, that's a good question. Now, you could use a sidebar, as you probably saw in some of our examples on the server, to create a little summary about yourself. So here I'll summarize myself. Oops, probably should uppercase my name. Let's see. There we go. That's pretty big. H2. What should I'll be a systems analyst. Analyst. It's not good if you can't spell your job title. All right. Well, you know, that's kind of lame. But whatever, let's just leave it in there. Oh, and I plug an image as well. Image source equals, I've already thrown an image into this folder. Let's see, person, that should be it. Let's see if that shows up. Cool, all right, I don't like that systems analyst. So let me get rid of that. And I could plug in some contact info down here, like maybe I'll do span and bwalsh5@elon.edu. Ooh, okay, that's hanging out there. I need to adjust that, the width of that. But you know, this is a really thin sidebar, so maybe it'd be better to just make the sidebar wider. There, that's a little better. And if we want to center our content in it, I can say margin 0 auto. Let's see if that works. Sometimes it does. Nope. So let me change that to text dash align. Oops, center. Yeehaw. All right, so that's what I mean by creating a sidebar that you might want to do something with for your resume. Now someone would see this contact info and I guess see all of my like jobs and stuff over here. It might be the case, and you can see actually that I probably need to make this a little taller, but we won't worry about that now. This scrolls, of course. So that's going to lead me to our next positioning rule. If I want this to stay on the screen, that is not scroll, and have my other content scroll, which would make sense for this setup, I would use the positioning rule fixed. So in that same box, I'm going to say position. Hang on a second. Let me move my code up so you can see it. Position fixed, I think I said. Now I need to warn you, when I save and refresh, it's going to cause more problems than it solves, but we'll get there. Let me refresh. So the problem, as you can probably see, is that my text now falls behind this element. But watch what happens when I try to scroll here. You know, my content is not tall enough to scroll. Let me, let's see. Let me increase the line height. And that should make it tall enough to need to scroll. There we go. Now you can see, oh, I screwed up my name. You can see how it's scrolling now pretty well. Maybe I'll just make this 40 pixels. Maybe that'll help. That my name issue. There we go. So you can see my content, which you can pretend is my resume, would be scrolling. And this sidebar just sits here. So that's a pretty cool idea, because someone could scroll through my resume and then be like, oh, I will contact this person or something like that. Remember, it's required that there's a way to contact you on your resume project. It could be social media or email or whatever you want. So that's kind of cool, but we need to fix this problem that I mentioned. Again, my text is falling kind of in behind this right here. So how can I fix that? Well, we could try writing some sort of margin rule, but I don't think it's going to work, because when this thing is, the whole reason that this problem arose is that this element is position fixed. So I think we could write all the margin and padding we want, and it's not going to solve the problem with our text. I think for our text we need to solve the problem ourselves. So let's see. Those are all a bunch of p tags, if I'm not mistaken. Yes, these are all p tags. You know, the proper way to do this would probably be to put all the p tags in some sort of wrapper. But I'm just going to say p margin left. And what should we set the margin left to? Well, if you remember, we set the width of our box to 320. So I needed to scoot to the left at least that much. And actually, we had also created a margin right, so we were imagining our paragraphs would be 30 pixels past this. So I'm going to say margin left 350 pixels. Save and refresh. There we go. That's looking much nicer. And it does a nice scroll. Okay, so again, that's a summary of how to use fixed positioning on a sidebar. But let's say we don't want to use a sidebar. Let's say that's not what we're doing. We were imagining instead some sort of header going across the top of our page that says all this stuff too. Okay, well, we can do that too. Again, here's my box with all the code for this element. Let me turn some things off, change them. This has a width of 320 pixels. If I want to create something that goes across the top of my page, let me change that. Remember, we're in a wrapper, so if I say width of 960 pixels, that should fill the wrapper. It does. I'm going to turn off this height rule. Okay, it's off, so that's nice. But you remember, we wrote another height rule down here for 1150. I got to turn that one off. Okay, so that's, you know, kind of working. My layout's a little wacky. Let me turn this float off. We don't need that either. That's a little bit better. I would like all these elements to be stacked. Let's see. I think the problem is that I use a span tag here. I'll just change that to a P. And that should make my email go underneath. There we go. I think there's still some wacky rules going on, though. Oh! When I said P, it listened to this margin left rule. That's my problem. Alright, let me change that back to a span. You know, we'll just leave it for now. You can see that the same basic thing is happening with our header. It works. It's up there. It might be a little overly tall. It's taking up like a third of the browser window. But the problem is this text is falling underneath it. So if I go to my style sheet, I don't need a margin left here. I need a margin top. And I don't know what it needs to be. Let me try 250. No, that's not really going to work. It's getting there. You can also see that when I say P margin top 250 pixels, it's adding it to every one of these paragraphs. So that's not at all what I want. So let me switch to my index and say, hey, I'm going to wrap all my P tags in some other tag that will, I can just write rules for that. So I'm going to use a new tag called article. So article opens here. Before my P tags, let me take its closing tag and go all the way to the bottom. And put it in right there. Okay, so this article, if you're wondering, article does the exact same thing as div. There's no difference except the name. And the name implies something. It implies that, the name implies that it's an article, which is kind of true. It's a resume. Anyways, I could have done this with div. It's just we've got a whole bunch of divs in our page, right? But here, let's do that to keep things clear. Div, and I'll give it a class. Class equals, what should we call it? How about text? That's nice and vague. Okay, so over here, back where my box is, I need to write a rule for dot text. And again, I think the problem we're having would be margin top, margin dash top, I don't know, 300 pixels. Let's see what that does. That looks pretty good. I'm assuming that's the first bit of text here. Let me just make it 350 and we'll see if it changes. Oh, no, that is the first bit of text. Okay, so that would be my opening line. So again, with a fixed header, it will be stuck at the top here, and I'm just scrolling behind it. And that's pretty cool. But the problem is, obviously, when you make things positioned, especially position fixed, this is what we're doing now, it kind of changes the layout of them. So you'll usually explicitly have to state their width, and you will have to create some margins inside the element, or more realistically, create some margins for your other content to go around that element. So that's a fixed header. There's also a fixed sidebar. You don't really want to do both, but using one or the other, I think, is a good idea for this resume project. It's not a requirement, but it might be a good idea. It's also not required that it's fixed, so I could just allow this to scroll, and if I wanted to see what that's like, I'll just turn this rule off, and it scrolls. I'd have to remove that spacing, but I'm not too worried about that. Okay, so that's a brief little rundown of some of those positioning rules. So let me turn off position fixed. Yeah, okay. We've got a really wide box here. I'm going to set this back to 200 by 200. So it becomes a little guy like that. It's got some content in it. You know, I'll turn that content off. So let's see, here's all the stuff in there. Let me turn it off. And now it's just a box, right? It's not doing anything. There is a reason I'm showing you this. I wanted to show you what relative positioning can do. So if I change this from position fixed to position relative, and hit save and refresh, you'll notice nothing happened. Just saying position relative doesn't do anything. As I explained in class, what position relative does is you can move your element relative to its original position. This is its original position, just where it's landing on the page without this rule. But if I now give it rules like top 50 pixels, save and refresh, you can see it moved down from the top 50 pixels. And I can say left 50 pixels. You can see it scoots in from the left 50 pixels. So relative positioning means relative to where it was going to land anyways, I want to move it a little bit with top, left. You can do bottom and right as well to scoot an element around. Now, you do not need to know how to use relative positioning in order to complete the resume assignment. In fact, you don't have to use any CSS positioning rules at all in the resume assignment. But I did want to point out how relative positioning works, because it's kind of useful. The same pretty much goes for position absolute. Let me save this. Now again, if I refresh, you can see my element ends up in its kind of default spot again. So unless I give it some rules about where I want it to go, that's where it's going to land. I will say top 0, left 0. When you're using 0 for anything, you don't have to enter the unit of measurement, like in this case pixels, because 0 is 0. But anyways, top 0, left 0, you would think that would probably be about the same as it is right now, but if we refresh, you'll see that my box actually moves over. Because when you position something absolutely, it doesn't care anymore that, in this case, it's inside a wrapper or something like that. It's just going to go straight outside of it. In other words, when you position something absolutely, the default is to have that element be positioned absolutely relative to the browser, not to where it lands in the code. So again, this was inside the wrapper. You maybe would think position absolute would position absolutely inside the wrapper, but it doesn't. It comes out of the wrapper and now it's over here. And obviously, it is more than happy to overlap other content on your page. you'll notice that it scrolls still when it's positioned absolutely. That's not a big deal. One thing we'll play around with in class, and I just want to remind you of it, is we can make these values negative if we so desire. So here it is at negative 50 pixels. You can see it just scoots off the page a little bit. Nothing useful about that other than that's what it does, just telling you. So that's absolute positioning. Absolute positioning can cause some really big problems on your pages, especially when things overlap. But there are some things you can really only achieve with CSS positioning. And again, there's no need for you to do this for the resume assignment, but it's the easiest way to get something into the bottom right-hand corner of the browser. That's for sure. Okay, so let me get rid of all of those rules and bring this thing back to the way it was. I want to give I guess a practical example of how to use positioning. And the positioning that we'll be playing around with, well, it will be two kinds. It will be absolute and also relative. Okay, so here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to switch over to my index and write a little fake bit of my resume. So let me make a whole lot of room so you can't miss what I'm doing. I'm going to create a div here, and let me give it a class, the class of job. My thinking here is that if I'm going to list out a whole bunch of jobs in my resume, let's say I would list out 3, 4, or 5 jobs, I should probably create a class of job because I can just reuse that same structure over and over again. So that's the first thing I'm showing you. The other thing is how you can use CSS positioning to adjust the layout of your content. So I've got a job. Well, I do have a job, but I'm writing about a job, and when I write about a job in a resume, I'd probably say something like, let's see, I'll do this with a span tag. And the reason I'm using span is, remember, that's inline. I want all these things on the same line. I want to say the name of my job and when I worked there. So I'm going to say span class. Again, I'm using class because I'm going to reuse it. Class equals, I guess, job title. You may remember me going over this in class. Here I'll be a systems analyst. Much better place to put that than where I had it before. Let's see if this is showing up. Okay, there's systems analyst. And let me add another span. Span class equals job dates. So when I worked the job, I'll say February 2010 to March 2013. All right. And that is not quite how I wanted that to show up, so that's what we're going to play around with. Let's see. Just want to make sure. I don't think I closed this job div. No, it doesn't look like it. Oh yeah, I did. Okay, it's this right here. Okay, so here's our section that we've created. Let me save it. So we created the class job, job title, and job dates. Let me switch over to my style sheet. So I would say .job, .job title. Yes, CSS is case sensitive, so if you give your classes a capital letter, you have to keep using it. And job dates. Now, I still haven't done anything with these, obviously, but the first thing I want to say is under job, I'm going to say border 1 pixel solid black. Or, well, that's not going to work unless it's 1 pixel, not a pixel. Okay, now I like to put boxes around everything. This isn't a requirement for your resume. You may find this visually appealing, which is fine. Feel free to use borders. That's how most people use them. I use it to just indicate the edges of things, so I know that this whole element is my job div. Okay, so systems analyst. That looks fine where it is. I want this date all the way over here on the right-hand side. So how are we going to fix that? Well, one thing I could do, I think, based on what we learned in the past, is I could probably say float right on that job date. And if we refresh, well, it scoots right over there, and it looks pretty good. And it's going to get cut off when I shrink below 960 because that's my wrapper's width, but if I make my wrapper responsive, this will move with it. That is, it'll just stay it'll hug the right edge no matter how big or small the wrapper is. But I haven't made this responsive, so it's cutting off. So that's one way to make it so your content shows up on the same line, side by side. And it works pretty well. It can cause some problems because remember, with floats, you often have to clear the float later on. But what I want to do is show you how you can achieve the same end using CSS positioning. Okay, so we're back to where we were, where this text is jammed up against here. So what I could do instead is say position absolute. And then I could say, let's see, who's calling me? Well, I wouldn't say that. Let's just wait that one out. Sorry for the repetitive ringing. So we said position absolute. I want to position this to the right. So I bet if I said right 0, that would push it all the way to the right. Let's see. Okay, and it did. But you can see it's actually hanging out of the wrapper. Like we saw before, when you position something absolutely, it positions itself to the edge of the browser, not to its containing element. Well, that's what I want to change. I want to make it so this thing is positioned absolutely, but I want to position absolutely to the far right of its containing element, namely this job div. So there's a way to do that. Here's my containing element, job. If I say position relative on that element, as we've seen before, when you say position relative to an element and you don't specify top, bottom, left, right, it's basically just going to say where it is. It's not going to move around. But if I now refresh, you'll see that my absolutely positioned text moves in because my absolutely positioned element is inside a containing element that's also positioned. And just by doing that, it changes things. So when I tell this thing position absolute right 0, it calculates that right 0 based on the edge of the containing element. So that's why my text is ending right here. I have a brief blog post on this as well with a visual representation trying to explain it. Now again, this is not required on your resume, but it is a very graceful way of getting this appearance to work. And a float would probably work just as well, although you may have to write some additional rules to clear your float when you do it that way. So let me show you another thing you might want to be able to do for your resume. This is some new HTML. Let's see, I'm just going to do it right underneath our little job description. Oh, you know what? One thing I wanted to show you, this is kind of important. Let's say I had another job I wanted to list on here. I'm going to copy this entire div and paste it. If we refresh, you'll see nothing. Let me save. A second job. Okay. They're stacked a little tight to each other, so what I could do is under job, I could say margin bottom 20 pixels. That'll split them up. But can you see how this looks exactly the same? So for my second job, I could go in here and let's see, as a systems analyst, my first job now will be a network administrator. Anyways, it's going to look exactly the same, and that's good. An important thing stylistically about a resume is that it's designed consistently, so all your jobs look the same, all of your education looks the same, maybe everything looks the same, but it's very deliberate styling, and I think that's important. Okay, just wanted to throw that in there before I forgot. So the new code I wanted to show you, these are, again, not required, but you might want to be able to do them. There's this thing called a progress tag in HTML. It's kind of like a progress bar. But here's what I'm going to say. I'm going to say progress, and then it has some required parameters. I'm going to say value equals, let's see, 3, and then max equals 10. And then just let that close. So it doesn't seem like I wrote much. I didn't. But when I refresh, can you see that bar? It's kind of interesting, huh? So what if I said underneath that, like, span? Let's see. Coding skills. So here's a visual representation of my coding skills. Here, if I put that in a p tag, it should go to the line underneath. There we go. I still need to adjust my line height, but what I'm trying to do is indicate that these things go together, and I can say, hey, there's my coding skills. Here, I'll say div style equals border 1 pixel solid black. Let's see what that does. There, you can kind of see it in a box. I know it's not the best description, I guess. So that again is the progress value. I just made these numbers up. Value equals 3, max equals 10. That works. If you want to say you're really good at something, I'll get my value at 8 out of 10. And I'm doing a little better now. Okay, let me show you basically the same thing. I'm going to copy and paste, but this one is called meter. Let me change the closing tag as well. This looks similar. There is a meter, and you can see it's green. I think you can write some CSS to change that color. I don't remember. You'd have to Google it. I don't remember how to do it. These both look different in different browsers, so you don't have full control over their appearance, but they're always going to look roughly like this. So I thought it would be interesting, you know, instead of just saying like, I'm good at HTML and CSS, it's more useful to say, here's my HTML skill, here's my CSS skill, and represent it visually. You'll probably notice on our rubric I'm emphasizing the idea of visually representing as much as you can on your resume. Along those same lines, if you know Avid, I think the best thing to do to indicate that on your page is find a good, well, it's a lot of Avid images. Decades of college dreams? What a weird... This isn't at all what I was looking for. I was looking for this, Avid. I guess it's something else too. But anyways, I would stick that on there and maybe a progress bar next to it to indicate, yeah, I know Avid and I know it about 80% out of 100 or whatever it is you're going to say. So those are fun things. Again, not required, but you might want to do them. Blogs. Let's see. If you want some inspiration, I encourage you to, well, if you do something crazy like Google online resume, you're going to find some very interesting examples. Well, you'll find some builders. We don't really care about that. How about online resume example? But you'll also see some completely insane things. So you can use these as inspiration, but I wouldn't do more than that. It's a nice looking one, nothing fancy, but can you see how this lives on the web? It clearly doesn't, you'd never print this out or anything. It just has a look that fits with the internet as opposed to print. And that's something I encourage you to do. Lots of iconography, lots of ways to contact this person, a picture of them. Now again, you're not required to do a picture, but I think it's a good idea to include a picture of yourself, not in your normal resume, but on your online resume. Oh, this one looks fake. Yeah, I don't think that's well, maybe it's a real person, I don't know. But anyways, that's a bit of a standard resume, but she's still got images and pretty cool stuff in there. So you can find some cool things this way. Ooh, I like this one. Even more visual. Wow, that's like the tiniest image ever. But anyways, if you Google this stuff, you can find some cool things. You might also remember on our blog, I included, 8 or 10 examples from this year's iMedia class. So they just made those, and they may get a little bit more complicated than you want to get with yours, but it's certainly a good idea to take a look at them to get an idea or two. The only other thing I wanted to mention in this video screencast is this first step in getting started, which is when you're about to start this project and your resume is ready to go, I strongly recommend that you think about how you want it to look. And I very strongly recommend you draw it out, either by hand or in Photoshop. In Photoshop you can specify colors and fonts and things like that, so it might be a little bit more accurate. I would just do it wherever you're most comfortable. But just by, even if you scribble it out on a Post-it note, which full disclosure is usually what I do, it does force you to think critically about where you want things to go and why you want them to go there. I guarantee that will result in a better project for you. I mean, this is your resume, so you want to make sure it looks nice, right? So make sure when you get to a good stopping point in your resume and you think you're finished, you do one of two things, or preferably both. You check the rubric and make sure you've done everything I want you to do. So, for instance, all your links are supposed to open up in new browser windows. Test that. Please test that. I definitely noticed in our last assignment, even though most of you did a really good job on it, it was obvious to me that a handful of you had not tested your page in a browser before sending it to me. You'll be able to look at your resume and determine how good is it, because you're as good at determining what's good on the internet as I am. So if you look at your resume and it looks like garbage, then you're probably going to get a garbage grade. I don't think anybody's going to put themselves in that situation, but that's exactly why I'm telling you to think critically about how you want this thing to look before you make it. The other thing I wanted to say, that point 2, was like our last project, you can email me kind of work in progress and ask me what should I change or fix in order to get this thing, have it earn the best grade possible. I'd be happy to give you feedback on that. It doesn't require that you upload your content to your server and send me a link to it, but hey, you're going to have to do that to hand it in anyways, so it's fine with me. All right, folks, I'm signing off. It has been a pleasure this semester.